Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green.
And I'm your presenter, Paul Sheriff.
And we are continuing on with our series on building apps with XAML and .NET MAUI. And last time we looked at model view model, also known as the MVVM design pattern. And today we're going to look at dependency injection. Now we could obviously spend entire episodes on this and have in the past, but you're going to give us a succinct and brilliantly succinct overview of dependency injection. What is it and why should we use it?
Yeah, so what I thought I'd do is start out again with just a few slides. I mean, there's nothing, not a lot here, but just to give us an example, and and then we'll actually look at the implementation of it. But like you said, it's like why? Well, dependency injection does help us reduce coupling between classes, which is always important. Gives us great code reusability. Really makes our applications a lot easier to modify, test, and maintain. And you'll see why as we get into this. And then it really allows us to reuse objects that are already created. So that reduces our instantiation time.
Okay.
And that, I think, is really a big reason why you want to take advantage of it as well. So let's kind of give you a little example here. In our view model, let's say we wanted to create an instance of a user repository class. So the repository class is going to be the one that goes out to your database, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to request the data using the entity framework, let's say. Okay. So we create this class. And then what would happen, though, is if you want to change that repo class to now get data using a web API call, right? So if you're using that user repository class throughout your whole view model and using it here and there and everywhere, if you want to change that to do a web API, now you got to rewrite that whole repository class. And then are you going to lose the old code? What are you going to do, right? So if you really think about, you got hundreds of these things going on. You got 100 view models, you got 100 repositories. You want to kind of change everything. You'd be hitting a lot of places in your code to change code. Mm-hmm. To say, hey, you know what? And I got to change this from this user repository to this user repository API. It's just way too many changes to make.
Okay.
So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use an interface. So we typically want to use an interface with dependency injection for any services that could change.
Okay.
And the reason why is because now the view model is just going to get an interface. And it's not going to care whether you pass the repository class that does the entity framework or the repository class that does a web API call. As long as they both implement that interface, the view model doesn't know about it, doesn't care about it.
Okay.
So this reduces coupling, right? It makes things a lot easier for us to just change things out and how we want to, the implementation of how things work. So how this works is MAUI is going to create what's called a services container, and it's just a structure. It's all it is. It holds service instances and or names of services. Mm-hmm. You're going to register the classes that you want to use through dependency injection with this container, and then .NET creates the instances of these objects for you, and then we'll insert them into the classes, like the view model classes, through constructors, or it could even be through the methods. So this is going to help us kind of eliminate creating a hard-coded instance of user repository in our view model, for instance, right? Okay. We could actually we're going to have an interface that we know that we can use these 5 methods. This is also called the inversion of control design pattern, whereas the views and the view model classes just really don't create the objects at all. They're just going to be passed them. So the way this works is you create a services container. Well, .NET MAUI has the services container. You're going to add to it maybe a logger, a data repository, a configuration, a security, and a diagnostic. So these would be all these interfaces that you have, right? And then you actually say, for this interface, for this particular run, I'm going to use the logger that logs to a file. Mm-hmm. The data repository is going to come from the entity framework. Configuration is going to come from a JSON file, for instance. Then maybe next time you say, oh, you know what? We need to change that logger. Instead of logging to a file, I want to log to a database. Okay. Well, where you do this is just in the MAUI program.cs. So the only thing you have to change is code in one place. Now what happens is the view says, well, I'm expecting you to pass me an iLogger. I don't care what kind of logger it is. Just give me an iLogger instance. So the first time we passed the file, the second time we said, no, we're going to log to a database. And then maybe view number 2, we say, well, I need a logger and I need a repository and I need a configuration. So we get an iLogger, an iRepository, and a config interface in the view model. But the concrete implementation is created in the program right at the beginning. And again, just in one place.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is, you'll see as we get into this is kind of the high level. But you'll see when we get into this where you make this one change. And that's really nice. Yeah, just a couple more things. There are what are called service lifetimes. So that services container is going to create these instances of objects, and they can create it as a singleton, which means it's created the first time they're requested. After that, it's always the same instance. So it doesn't create 5 or 10 of these. It's only going to create one. We typically use this for things like configuration settings and logging.
Okay.
We then have what are called scoped. Now, scoped are created once per client request. So the same one, like if you're in an MVC application, the controller, right? It's going to call it and create an instance of that, maybe that repository, that user repository. And here in Maui, we would pass it whenever that new view model is created. So it's destroyed then once that view model goes away, or once that view goes away and the view model is destroyed, then the repository, right, whatever that is, that user repository is destroyed at that time as well.
Okay.
So we use this for data that needs to stay around from one request to another within the view model. But after that, it can just go away. So if you had one view that uses the user view model and another view that uses the user view model, 2 different instances. So we get 2 different ones. Now, transient is another one. I'm just going to mention it really quickly. It's mostly used in MVC applications. It's created each time they're requested. And this could be different from controller to services. And then again, it's destroyed when the block is finished. So these aren't used too much, and they're really not used really at all in Maui, I don't think. I've never used one. I haven't seen a need for it.
Okay.
But we use these when we really need the data to be different between controllers or even methods within a controller. So not used that much, really.
Okay.
So that's it. I mean, that's the majority of, kind of the overview of dependency injection. So how do we do this, right? I mean, that's
the in action.
Yeah. So I'm going to go down to my common library, and I'm going to add another new folder called interfaces. Now, we're just going to do one interface. I mean, you'll get the idea. I'm going to build an interface for our repository classes that we're going to create. Okay, so I'm going to do an iRepository. Now, even though I created a class, I'm still going to replace all this, and I'm going to create a public interface called iRepository. And it's a generic, so it's going to be expecting you to pass some sort of entity class, so called T-entity. And right now, there's just simply 2 methods, a get and a get with the int ID. And we kind of saw those in the user view model there. We're going to kind of do the same thing in the repository. So let's use this. And you would do the same thing for like the view models. You would create an iView model interface as well. But for now, let's just do one. Let's add now a new project. Another class library. We'll call this one AdventureWorks.DataLayer. Okay, we'll create this. And we'll delete that class 1. We're going to add another new folder. And it's going to be called Data Classes. I'm a big fan of kind of creating things under folders. So I don't like a lot of things in my root. That's, again, just me. Don't worry about it. You don't have to do it. But in this data layer, let's make sure we add the dependencies to the entity layer and our common library, because we're going to use that repository. And if we're doing data classes, we need the entity classes to be able to build that. Okay. And then down here in our view model layer is where we're going to actually use the data layer. So we're going to set a reference to that.
Okay.
All right. Now, let's do the first thing here. And let's open up our user view model. And we're going to create another private variable here. So private read-only iRepository of user. Okay, it could be nullable. And it's just I'm simply going to call it repository. So it's iRepository. So somehow we need to be able to pass that in. Well, we're going to pass it in through constructors. Okay, I'm going to do constructor dependency injection. So in this user view model, I'm going to say I'm expecting someone to pass in a repository to me. It's an iRepository of user. Okay, so there we go. First thing is done. Then down here in this get ID method, right? We're going to come in here and we're going to add a little bit of code right here. So you can see I have this to do here. Get a user from a data store. Let's take the to do out because now we're going to actually do that. We're going to say, okay, let's get that user object by calling repository.get. Close that out. So this says, hey, if that repository is not null, which means somebody did pass that to me, then let's call the get. Remember, that's part of our interface right here.
Okay.
All right. So clear so far, right? Clear as mud, right? So how does this work? How do we get something into that? So down in the MAUI now, we go to MAUI program. Okay. I need to add, again, a reference to that data layer here because it's inside of here where I need to now actually tell it what it's going to inject. So the way we do this is we say builder.services.add scope. Okay, and it's going to be a type of iRepository. And I'm going to use that user object. Okay. And then the second, oops, sorry, hit the comma there. Okay. The second one is the actual implementation that we're expecting, the user repository. Remember, that's a hard-coded one that we're supposed to create right here. So let's add the class, okay, and we'll call it user repository. All right, so now we got this guy. Let's go ahead and, sorry, where is it? Oh, sorry, you know what? I wasn't going to create this on the fly for you. I was going to just bring in the code because it's much easier. So let's go ahead and bring this guy in a little bit easier. There we go. Okay. So this user repository implements the iRepository user. Right?
Okay.
Okay. And then here's our get. Now, this instance of it, this user repository is simply using hard-coded data. Okay. So this is our first implementation, right? But we could then switch this out and do the entity framework or web API calls or whatever. But the key is that I have a get method that is required for the interface. And then I have a get with an int ID passed in that I simply go and get whatever that user ID that's passed in, and it returns it back to us. So there we go. So now back in the MAUI program, right, as long as I add the appropriate AdventureWorks entity layer and the data layer, these all resolve. There we go. I have now said that wherever, so what this does, this says, hey, whenever an instance of the view model is going to be created, okay, it matches this guy up here with whatever's there. So if we look back here on this, where was it? The user view model. Here we go. See that? Those match.
Okay. Yeah.
This matches up with that. So that says, oh, well, then you should create an instance of this guy and pass him over. Okay.
So at runtime, I guess at runtime, is it at runtime or build time? I guess
no, this is runtime, and it creates the instance, right? You know.
Okay. So all you need to do is up front say, anytime my code's looking for an iRepository of user, use this user repository, and then if
create an instance of this.
A different repository, all you need to do is change user repository to other type of repository. And as long as the interface is the same, you don't have to touch any of the rest of your code.
You got it. So what you just said.
Nay.
So if I had a color repository that implemented an iRepository and a phone type repository and a product repository, okay, and then let's add the appropriate entity classes for those as well over here. color, a phone type, a product, a user.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now, yes, each of these have a get that returns, in this case, just hard-coded data. Okay. But each of them implement this interface. So now back here in the MAUI program, I can say iRepository of color and say use the color repository. Okay. So all of this stuff just then magically works, right? So let's go back and make sure.
So if you're, let me ask you this.
Okay.
So let's say you're writing an application, and at the moment you're just talking to one piece of data or one web API, and you're not going to swap back and forth. Then is this just a lot of unneeded overhead? Or is it just building in the ability to do it in the future, even if you don't know now when or why you might?
It's still something you want to do because it does help you when it comes to unit testing.
Okay.
Because if you think about your view model, you haven't tied your view model, or user view model, you haven't tied your view model to user repository, right?
Okay.
Because if you're doing unit testing, you may not want it to go out to the entity framework. You might not want it to call the web API. All you have is a mock that returns that data, but you're still testing the rest of the methods in your view model.
Okay.
So when you're doing unit testing, you can use the same type of, dependency injection to say, oh, let's use this guy. This is my user repository mock class.
Okay. Or I suppose during actual development, you could, when you're building the application and just trying to get the pages right and the business and data logic right, you just call an instance of SQLite locally, and then you're not either bugging the real life SQL server or racking up whatever money Azure SQL is charging you for going into Azure. Or you don't even need internet connectivity at that point because you're just talking locally.
Right.
And then when it comes time to use real data, all you need to do is swap one line of code and use a different repository, and then it's just trickles down through all the rest of your code. Is that a good way of thinking of it?
Got it. That's exactly the way you want to think about it. Yeah. So, and also, so over here in this view model layer, do I even need data layer? If I take that out, will it still compile?
Should.
Yeah. Because all I'm doing is the I repository, right?
Yep.
So then here's the great thing, right? So I don't need it there. Over here, in the dependencies for the MAUI program, if we look at the Windows one here, we can see I've got a reference to the AdventureWorks data layer. But maybe later on, I say, you know what, let's add. It's still compiling. But we would add another project called adventureworks.datalayer.api. Right? As long as we duplicated all of these that call web APIs, now we're just swapping this guy out. Right? Okay. And then there we go. Okay? Or you don't even have to swap it out. Maybe you have a configuration setting, and in your MAUI program, you wrap some sort of if statement around here that says, if entity framework, then use this set of them. Otherwise, use the others.
Yep.
Isn't that neat?
That is neat.
When you start looking at this, it makes sense to do this, even if you think you may not at some time in the future need to swap this out.
Because, the first time you look at this, it just seems like an awful lot of code to accomplish the exact same thing. So there's a bit of a cost involved in moving over to that. But,
a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. But I do love the idea of, as you're building an application, particularly with, talking to data, being able to talk locally to do all your development, which is you're not using the real live resources and seem a heck of a lot faster. And then when it comes time to using it in production, or you want to test with the data now sitting somewhere else, it just seems like it gives you the opportunity to do that much more easily. Yep. Cool.
Right. And then let's expand on this too, though. Okay. So the view, if you remember, I created an instance of the view right here, didn't I? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But how about this? How about instead of creating the instance here, we actually use dependency injection for this as well. Okay. So what we could do is, now I didn't create the interface for the view model. Okay. But let's say, you know, I did. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and say user view model up here. And then we will set view model equal to our view model that's being passed in.
Okay.
Okay, so now I can eliminate this. I don't care what that instance of that view model is. It's getting created now behind the scenes for me. Right? So there we go. Now we can do this. So if I do that, now I would come back here and I would then add in two new things. I would add in the user view model. Okay. And I would add the user detail view. I want both of these to participate in dependency injection. This one, now this is one that would typically be like view model.
Right.
Okay. But I don't have that for now. So I can just do this one. Okay. I want this guy to be the one that creates an instance of. The user detail view is going to be the recipient of getting that user view model. So he needs to also participate in the dependency injection. All right, so if I've done everything correctly, okay, hopefully I can run this. And so here I'm doing a get on number 1. All right, so it's going to call that view model get. All right, in fact, let's set a breakpoint in here and actually watch this happen. So let's set a breakpoint right here on the get, because that's what I'm calling from the on appearing, right? So right here. Okay, so let's go here and click navigate to detail. So we passed in our ID of 1. The repository is not null. So our dependency injection worked. It inserted, and look what it inserted. You can see the real value there, right? That user repository is actually the one that got passed in. Wonderful. So now we come here. It now does the get where it creates all those instances. It creates this whole collection. Okay. We then use a where clause, and we return this single user object that is now Paul S. at Paul's Auto Parts. And we now let it display, and there's our data. Pretty easy.
Cool.
Okay. Or we can come back over here. We go back and we say, let's get number 3. I don't even know who number 3 is. You know, now obviously we pass that in. In fact, we're going to do that a little bit later.
Sure.
Okay, but now we come in here. We'll get all for number 3. Let's go ahead and just let it run. And voila, there it is.
All right.
Okay. So yes, it's a little bit more work, but when you think about it, it's one interface, and then it's a few extra lines in the MAUI program. But really, when you think about the extensibility that you get from this, I think it's well worth it.
Yeah.
I really do. Okay. Now, let's do one more instance of this, though. Let's look at this. See, they've got home, mobile, and other. Do you remember where those are coming from? Those phone types?
Yeah, they were in a string there. Yeah.
Yeah, that array, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, how about we get rid of this? Okay, let's just get rid of this. And then let's go into our user view model. Okay, let's go to our user view model. And let's add, here in our private variables, I'm going to add a repository of phone type. So a phone type repository. And let's create an observable collection of strings called phone types list. Okay, then I will go ahead and create a public property here, which is my observable collection of phone types list. Okay. Now let's add then a method in here that will check to make sure our phone type repository is valid. And if it is, then we'll call its get method and use that to create our new observable list of strings. Okay, that's our phone type list. Cool. So then all we have to do is let's add another constructor here that will say, okay, I also need the repository for the user, but I also need the one for the phone repo as well. Okay. And then you can see both of those private variables are getting set. Excellent. Okay. So now if we go back to our MAUI program, And just add on one more of these. That's that iRepository phone type. And say, here's the concrete implementation of it.
Okie dokie.
And now in our view, we only need to do one more thing before we get the user, or after, doesn't matter, but we want to get those phone types. Okay? So you can see how little code I'm writing in the code behind.
Yeah.
Right? There's really not much. In fact, I could even take these two and kind of combine them into one method in my view model if I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? All right, so I deleted the array, the hard-coded array there. I now just have to go into my XAML, find that picker, this guy, change it from the static resource to I want to do the binding on phone types list. Remember, that's the one that we added, the observable collection we added in our view model. Okay? And you know, an observable collection means whenever something is added or removed from it, it automatically raises that notify property changed.
Right.
So that way it knows to refresh the list. So again, if I've done everything correctly, I've added that phone type repository, I've added a constructor, I added to dependency injection, that phone type repository, it should be able to run. We then click on the users here, go to the detail. Okay, I'll skip the breakpoint for now. And there it is.
Nice.
Okay. So really, I don't think of it. I mean, to me, it's like maybe a few extra lines of code that I have to do. I mean, how hard is it to implement an interface? Really easy.
Yep.
You write the interface once. So then the only thing you have to really think about is, what do I need to make sure is part of my dependency injection? You know, so here's my BI services.
Yep.
That's it. I mean, that's
cool.
To me, simple as it gets for dependency injection.
Love it. That was brilliantly succinct.
We try to be succinct. That's right.
Excellent.
Cool.
Very, very cool. What are we going to look at next?
All right. Well, coming up next, we're going to take a look at commanding. So instead of, again, writing code behind, remember the save button clicked event that we did?
Yep.
We're going to remove that, and we're going to put it in the view model and have our XAML call the view model method directly.
All right. Awesome. So stick around for that. We will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.